This Sunday is Pentecost. It's 10 days after Jesus has ascended into heaven, and the Bible describes so-called tongues of fire that land on the early disciples. And these disciples started speaking different languages. And because these tongues of fire coincided with a very large Jewish festival that brought people from all over into Jerusalem, these disciples received a lot of attention because people could understand the languages that they were speaking. And it gave Peter the opportunity to preach to those gathered in amazement, reminding these people that the Spirit can be poured out on all sorts of people, the young, the old, slaves, men and women, you name it. The Spirit can be poured out on anyone. And today, in the midst of our global pandemic, and in the midst of, once again, protests and shouts of injustice over racial oppression in this country, it might feel like we are actually experiencing the pains of simply fire. Not tongues of fire, but just fire, a scorching, rather than miraculous tongues of fire that amaze and connect strangers. In both Hebrew and Greek, the word for spirit means breath or wind. It's ruach in Hebrew, it's pneuma in Greek. And the sense is breath of wind. It carries the meaning of life-giving. Like we have air to breathe, we have the Spirit who gives us life and connection with God and with others. But how do you grab onto breath? You can't. And even with huge wind turbines that produce energy, the wind keeps going. You can't pin it down. Who the Spirit is and what the Spirit does, and even how to image the Spirit, has been a source of lots and lots and lots of imaginative imagery. And I'm going to offer just a few metaphors and images that have been used to describe the person and the work of the Holy Spirit. Some are contemporary and some are very historical. The theologian Elizabeth Johnson writes that the Spirit is the creative origin of all life. And this work, this creative work, is continuous and never-ending from the beginning of time. The Spirit is the unceasing, dynamic flow of divine power that sustains the entire universe, bringing forth life. 15th century Catherine of Siena, who is a saint and a doctor of the church, wrote about the Holy Spirit as a food server. In the Trinity, God the Father is the table, Jesus is the food, and the Spirit dispenses the food. And Catherine wrote that God spoke to her of this metaphor. Quote, "This gentle waiter, the Spirit, carries to me, to God, people's tender loving desires, and then carries them back to the people. The sweetness for my, God's charity, for their enjoyment and nourishment. So you see, says God, I am the table. My Son is their food, and the Holy Spirit who proceeds from me and the Son waits on them." The Spirit serves all sorts of different food. All sorts of different food. For the soul, for the mind, for the neighbor. But the Spirit also serves us hunger. Hunger for God, for the world, for our neighbors. Hildegard of Bingen was an 11th century abbess and mystic, and she lived amongst lush green forests, and she excelled in herbal remedies and in innovative music, and she described the work of the Spirit as greening, and she writes to the Spirit, "O most honored greening force, you who roots in the sun, you who lights up in shining serenity within a wheel that earthly excellence fails to comprehend. You are enfolded in the weaving of divine mysteries. You redden like the dawn, and you burn, flame of the sun." The Holy Spirit as a greening force. And Hildegard's contemporary and friend, Bernard of Clairvaux, wrote that the Holy Spirit was a kiss between God the Father and God the Son. The Spirit is actually the kiss between God the Father and God the Son. The Spirit is the intimate connection between the two, the indivisible unity. And my neighbor's rooster is getting in on it too. In the poetry of St. John of the Cross, the Holy Spirit is described as a south wind that awakens love in all capacities. Korean scholar J.Y. Lee speaks of the Spirit as protective cloth that protects. But Lee also speaks of the Spirit as a weaver and as a protector of all things on earth. 20th century Lutheran theologian Wolfhart Pannenberg argued that the notion of God as Spirit was similar to the scientific concept of a force field, that the whole cosmos is an interconnected web of life that is both brought forth and sustained by the exchange of energy. So the Holy Spirit as a force field of energy that sustains and brings forth all life within this interconnected web of life that we are in and the cosmos is in. So these are really interesting ways of looking at the Spirit, aren't they? I hadn't thought of any of them, actually. And there are an infinite number of ways to try and describe and understand the person and work of the Holy Spirit. What does it take to open up our views and understand who the Holy Spirit is? For some people, the famous novel that was written over a decade ago, The Shack, offered different ways of looking at each person of the Trinity. The Spirit was described as the appearance of fractals, and Jesus was a Middle Eastern man, like he actually was, clad in a flannel shirt and jeans who liked to go fishing. And God was a large black woman. And these images all made sense, even if we'd never thought of them before. So if we open up and expand our perceptions of who God is and what God can do, our faith becomes more expansive. It becomes more limitless and more gracious, more filled with possibility. In our biblical passages for today, people couldn't believe what God was doing. Such things had never been imagined before. How do people suddenly start speaking languages they don't know? Can prophecy really be done by women and children? By slaves? Really? In the Numbers passage, Moses and a bunch of other people were away from their Israelite camp and they started prophesying. And two guys who weren't with the group, but who were instead back in the camp, they started suddenly prophesying too. And while the group was still outside of the camp, Moses was brought the news of these rogue prophesiers. I think I might have made up that word, but prophesiers. And this news bringer expected that Moses would want these two rogue prophesiers to be shut up. They're not with you, Moses, so they're in the wrong. They need to be stopped. And Moses answers like Jesus does when his followers complain that others were doing miracles, but they were not in the in-group. They both answer, let them be. Let them be. God cannot be contained in singular ideas. God cannot be contained just to particular groups. Like wind, the Trinity cannot be pinned down. Like wind, God will move where God will move. Paul Tillich said that the Spirit's scope, the scope of the Spirit, expands to all dimensions of society. All of it. To art, to culture, to politics, to everything. The Spirit's scope is everything. Jürgen Moltmann sees the Spirit at work wherever there is passion for life. Wherever there is passion for life. In life over death, in liberation over oppression, in justice over injustice. And the church may or may not be involved in the work of this Spirit, but we're certainly invited. Right now we have political instability. We have COVID-19 and over 360,000 deaths worldwide. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Can God be here? Can God be here? How? If the Holy Spirit is uncontainable, how can God not be here? The question is, how do we understand God's presence? Not only that, but how do we get involved? How do we enter into the Spirit who is already at work? Can we see the Spirit working for racial justice? Can we see the Spirit working in the pain and in the loss of so many COVID deaths? Can we see the Spirit working in us who are often caught in the confusion of how to see and understand things when our news sources, whichever way we lean, are so often biased? Can we see the Spirit inviting us to expand our imagination of who God is and how much can be healed and how we can actually play a part? This Sunday is Pentecost. If there's ever a time to welcome in God in crazy, never before seen ways, today is the day. So let's take a moment to pause and reflect, literally. What is the image that you've always had about the Holy Spirit, about who the Holy Spirit is and what the Spirit does? What are those images? What are those images? Just take a moment to think about that right now. At this point, there's no need to say that whatever image you conjured up is incorrect. But what if it can be bigger? And if it is bigger and more imaginative, what might that accomplish? Might it find new ways to meet and welcome our neighbors? Might it find ways to bring justice and freedom for all persons in this nation? Might it empower a vibrant faith that is led by an uncontainable Spirit that wants deep healing and meaningful life for all life on this whole planet? To some degree, the limits of what is possible lie in our imagination. We get bogged down with, this can never happen, or I don't know what to do, or we just can't change. I'll be honest, I get inundated with feelings of helplessness all the time. I don't know what to do about COVID. I don't know what to do to solve systemic racial oppression. Some people do, and they start effective large-scale campaigns, and that might even be this church, who knows? But I do know that things can change on larger levels with simple, small acts of courage on a personal level. Might the Spirit be calling us to get to know our neighbors, especially the neighbors who are most unlike us? Our text today tells us that anyone can be in the Spirit. Anyone, old, young, men, women, slaves, free, those in the camp, those outside the camp, and everyone has gifts of the Spirit given to them. 1 Corinthians 12:7 says, "To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good." What is your life-giving, Spirit-given gift that is available for the common good? How might it be exercised in ways that you have never imagined? Children of God, we are located in this unpredictable, uncontainable Spirit. As I sit on my front porch surrounded by bird noise and roosters and rain, the Spirit is here. The Spirit is everywhere. The wind is everywhere. May we exercise our imagination for what is possible with this Spirit. May we exercise our courage to act and to do things we may never have imagined us doing, all for the common good, all in the limitless capacity of the Spirit. Amen.